Hello, everyone. Dr. Nick Hilvermer here with another edition of Things I Didn't Learn in Med School. Today, I want to talk about an interesting concept. This was brought to me from a recent podcast that I listened to. Sam Harris's Making Sense podcast with physician B.J. Miller and Shoshana Berger. And really, what the podcast was about preparing and transitioning for the end of life care. Um, the title of the podcast specifically was episode 297, Preparing for the End, a conversation with BJ Miller and Shoshana Berger. It is a concept that I find very interesting, and I don't know why I'm continuously drawn to this topic. And every time I hear about it and listen about it, or read about it, it gets me into some very curious thoughts of why we don't have better access to care for the end of life measures. I'm not going to try to recite everything they talked about in the podcast. They bring up a lot of good points, such as, preparing, what tools we have out there, what hospice is, what palliative care is, what advanced directives are, and all these kind of things. I'll touch on some of these points, but I think it's important if you have more interest in this topic to go listen to the podcast. It's interesting as well because Sam Harris had talked about his own journey where he, you know, finds himself probably thinking about death more often than his colleagues and his peers. And I also found that interesting because that's something similarly that I do. Um, and not in a like morbid and dark, gray, dramatic way, but it's just a concept of trying to understand life and death and understanding the knowledge and connection between it all. Um, he does talk about how he took, about 10 years off from work and just kind of went to go explore himself and meditation retreats and in Asia where he would go to silent retreats and understand different teachings and all this stuff. And then when after that he majored in philosophy because he had this deep, deep desire to understand the meaning of it all. Uh, but he still had a fascination with the human brain. So he also went to get his PhD in neuroscience. So it's something that's fascinating that you hear the story of Sam Harris and he's constantly thinking about these life and death and the meaning of life, the meaning of death, and how it all connects, and how it can make a more uh, meaningful experience throughout it all, from the beginning to the end and beyond. And it's such a similar concept that's brought up time and time again in the book When Breath Becomes Air, um, which is a book that I read at least every other year, if not every year. And every time I pick it up, I find some new insight and some new meaning. If you don't know the story, the neurosurgeon, slipping my mind of his name because he doesn't talk about himself in the first person, but by Paul Kalanithi. Um, he was a neurosurgeon going through his neurosurgery career, and he was on the brisk of, being the top neurosurgeon in his residency program, going through about to enter his final year of training. If anyone knows, neurosurgery training is grueling. It's 7 years of added residency and work and all this stuff. Um, but he also had such a fascination with the death and the mind and how the mind connects with the meaning of life and what it means to die. Um, I find that book so fascinating, and it's one of the books that brings me back to why I decided to ultimately become a physician, or at least gives me the courage to know that there's something more to my life, more to the message out there that we can get across. and it's been a big inspiration for me. So that's another reason why I found this podcast so interesting. Um, Another interesting point about this podcast is how BJ Miller, Dr. BJ Miller, he actually is a triple amputee from a near death experience. So he had more reason to do this kind of work. So he writes about it. So he's an author, and he wrote this book, A Beginner's Guide to the End of Life. So, he's deeply involved in this. He had worked for, he may still work for this company called the Zen Hospice Company or something along those lines. And he does a lot with them and has a different idea of, when we're transitioning to the end of life care is, don't post these people up in, hospital rooms, ICU rooms hooked up to all these things, but, get them to a very pleasing environment, aesthetically pleasing, all the bells and whistles, whatever you want kind of situation. And within reason, obviously, but, um, you know, they talk about a story of having the last day be the choice of the patient. And it could be so meaningful to that person and the family where you come and you have a celebration of life, and all the friends and family that can come in and say what they want to say and talk about what they want to talk about. And the great thing at the end of life, and one of the most powerful things I heard in the statement was you have that opportunity to say, I am sorry, please forgive me, I forgive you, thank you, and I love you. And those are words we just don't say enough. And those are words that I guarantee everyone that has lost a loved one or a friend or a family member, um, I'm sure those are words that you want to say to them. And wouldn't that be amazing if we could do that before? So, that was a really powerful moment. But they talk a lot about preparing for the end of life care. I find it's fascinating that if you look up the article, How Doctors Die, physicians are very much less likely to take these end of life care measures to the extremes, um, knowing what we know and seeing what we see, uh, knowing the burden it can be on family and resources, um, et cetera, et cetera. So often we rely on the family members to be the decision makers for the patient when maybe that's not what the patient wanted if they knew all the facts. Um, and there are patients out there and people out there that are like, even if we save somebody's life for 1 minute, it would all be worth it. And I completely respect that decision. Um, and that's not a decision for me to make. But it does bring up a good point. If you are, I mean, at any time, you should sit down and talk about these concepts with your loved ones. You should ask them, what are your plans? If this happens, what would you like us to do? And this doesn't have to be a binding contract day to day, year to year, but like talk about it frequently. My brother and I talk to our parents about it all the time. My brother's talked to me about it in depth and detail, what he would like me to do if he was ever like that. So, it's a tough decision for a family member to make, but if that's the wishes of somebody that you love, you would go ahead and probably respect those wishes. Um, you know, it'd be great if we could always know what's going to happen, and sometimes these decisions aren't the best decisions. But it brings me back to a time that I was working in my intern year, and I had a patient who had a fall. Um, they were afraid it was a stroke. Came in late Friday. They admitted her. Waited for the CT scan, MRI, and they wanted to do a quick discharge. on Saturday. Maybe she came early Friday. I forget. Anyways, um, imaging suggested something that was an anomaly. But the interesting thing was it was tucked so deep into the note that, usually if you see pathological thing on a radiology report, it's at the top, but it was tucked down at the bottom. And I forget exactly what the phrasing was, but it said something like most likely an aneurysm or something along those lines. So, kind of, call my attending. I said, I don't like what this says. I said, okay, call the radiologist. Of course, the radiologist has read the report, was out of the hospital already. Okay, call the neurology team. Called the neurology team. They said, yeah, we looked at it. We'll have to get an advanced imaging test. So all these things. So what ended up happening is this lady ended up staying over the weekend because they couldn't do the test until Monday morning. And then, obviously at this time she was on a stroke protocol and et cetera. So, there were less risks and we're keeping a close eye on her. But the big thing was she was up, walking, talking. We weren't worried, but that one thing on the report couldn't get back to us in time. So, anyways, the moral of all the story is, I had the extra time on those weekend rounds to sit with her, and I, just end up coming back in the afternoon and talk to her. I think I probably talked to her for an hour and 45 minutes that day. And we started discussing books and recent books I read. I had just finished reading When Breath Becomes Air. I had just read Becoming Mortal by uh, Atul Gawande. I've read a lot of books about intern year and physicians' personal stories. Um, Doctored and interned are two good ones that come to mind. Um, and it was just a very warming conversation, and it was so interesting because she's like, and I asked her, like, what have you ever thought about these things? Have you talked to your daughter about it? It was very highly involved and highly worried about her mother, obviously. And she's like, no, I really haven't. So I wrote down the books that I had just read. I said, I would just say go read about them, and whatever you decide, it should be your decision, and you should talk to your daughter about it. Um, Ultimately, everything came back negative for her, and the radiologist report actually should have read there most likely is not an aneurysm, and that's why I was so deep in the note. So, you know, at the end of it all, we said our goodbyes, but I felt like I don't know if I made a difference for her that day or not, but at least I got the conversation started. And it ended up being such a pivotal point in my career as a physician because it happened on my third month of intern year. Um, I was brand new. I didn't know what I was doing really. But at that time, I started having these conversations more and more with my patients. Um, we always remember, the first patient that died, even though there's despite nothing that we could have done personally, but that you were rendering the care. Um, and I remember having this conversation over and over again with this other family where his family was so adamant about natural causes and natural this and it was caused by the molars in his mouth and all this stuff. But, um, you know, at that point, we had seen him have such severe ALS that it was like he was non-functional, couldn't even talk at this point. So um, I I brought this conversation up gingerly the first time to the family members, and we brought it a few other times. And eventually, I said, let me just have the palliative care team come talk to you guys. That doesn't mean that you have to agree to it or anything. And thankfully, the team was great, and they were able to help. And I think the terminology of it's assisted suicide or assisted killing or whatever kind of went out the window once he said it's like, no, what we're doing is we're allowing him to die naturally. We're not gonna pump the body full of all this stuff, and once we're talking on the same wavelength, I think the family understood what was going on and the reality of the situation. And they did just that. They spent the last few weeks with the patient in the hospice unit at the hospital, and they were able to really enjoy the last few moments. And everyone came by and said their goodbyes and all that stuff, and he died peacefully, or at least, that's what we feel would happen in that situation instead of getting poked and prodded and every little infection being treated and x-rays and scans and all that stuff. So just another thing to think about when we're making these end of life decisions, and um, how these things are really important. Um, I first heard BJ Miller when he came on the Tim Ferriss podcast about my same time I intern year. So it's just like kind of how all this stuff is coming full circle. Man, 9 years ago. I mean, it's crazy. Because I do find myself thinking about these kind of things more often than I probably should. And again, it's not in a negative way. I'm not saying that I think about death like, oh, I need to die or someone's going to die. It's like, no, it's like, what would I, what kind of life do I want to make a full and meaningful life now that I can't? This is a very big reason why I moved back to Ohio, despite having good job offers in Florida, or I could have went out to Colorado and started something that these are appealing places I would have liked to live. Um, could have went back to New York. I had all these offers, but the important thing is in the reality of the thing is, you know, I hate to say it, sound morbid when I phrase it like this, but at best, I have 20 summers left with my parents. You know, at best, at very best. If average life age is upper 70s. Um, why would I not want to spend more time with them, as much time as that I can? Um, it's great that I get to see them every week now. It's great that I get to talk to them more. Um, I'm taking a massive pay cut. I'm taking a massive uh, luxurious lifestyle cut. But for me, it's way more important to be able to spend time with them. And I think that's what's important. And that's what's important for me. Um, I think this is a good idea for us to learn how to have these conversations, not only for our patients, so we can better understand what their wishes are as a patient, um, in a safe environment, but also how to have this conversation with your parents, grandparents, your siblings, your significant others, and all the above. Um, all that stuff is really important. And I think it's only going to improve how you communicate with yourself and patients, and how better transitions of care, um, when it does come down to it. Something that I'm really interested about and I found super fascinating is the patients that there's a study out there of patients that had a psilocybin assisted therapy session uh, had much less fear of dying. They were quicker to come to the acceptance phase, and they had much more graciousness when they were passing. I think that study shows that not only does the therapy work, I think that's an important thing. It's not just people taking psilocybin, but it was a therapy with someone that's guided in a highly controlled medical setting. If you get nauseous, anxiety, suicidal ideation, um, psychosis from this, there's remedies to help taper that down with modern medicine. Um, so I think it's important. And I think that'll be a huge win once we have more data about this, if it comes out to be true. Um, I'd be very interested to see if we'd be able to do that in more centers, especially in places that are underserved communities, because I feel like it's easy for some communities to get these kind of access to care, but it's not easy for everybody. So, anyways, just a few topics or a few talking points if you're interested in this topic. Again, the book is called A Beginner's Guide to Life, Guide to the End of Life by B.J. Miller, B.J. Miller and Shoshana Berger. Becoming Mortal, um, When Breath Becomes Air. Look up BJ Miller's podcast with Tim Ferriss in like 2016, 2015, 2016. Again, one of the most fascinating uh, podcast episodes I've ever heard. This most recent podcast with BJ Miller and Shoshana Berger with Sam Harris on the Making Sense podcast. I'll link to a lot of these things in my show notes on the YouTube channel and also on my Instagram. So, anyways, everyone, hope you guys are having a good week, good month. I know the days are becoming shorter, but I just really enjoy the fall weather, and I hope to hear from you guys. If you have any questions, please leave me some comments, ask some questions. Happy to reach out if you message me directly, and I'll talk to you guys soon. Take care. Bye.